On this lawsuit that was filed by young Jane Doe, it says Jane Doe plaintiff versus Sean Combs, Harvey Pierre, the third assailant, Diddy's House Recordings, Inc., Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings, Inc. as well. Now, if you guys notice, this also has a trigger warning. And what's very interesting about this was the same trigger warning that was on Cassie's statement, okay? It says, trigger warning, this document contains highly graphic information of a sexual nature, including sexual assault. On top of that, the same lawyer that is defending this Jane Doe is also the same lawyer that Cassie used to get her settlement in 24 hours. So they just go on to talk about that in the first 2 pages. So I'm going to go down to where the story starts. So around line 6, it says here, specifically in 2003, when she was only 17 years old and in the 11th grade, Miss Doe was sex trafficked and ganged by Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre and a third assailant. In short, when she was a teenager, Miss Doe met Mr. Pierre and the third assailant in a lounge in Detroit, Michigan. Then they also go on to state on line 18, in 2003, Miss Doe was a 17-year-old 11th grader residing in the suburb of Detroit, Michigan. At the time, Mr. Combs, who was 34 years old, twice the age of Miss Doe, and one of the most well-known and influential music artists of all time. A decade later, Mr. Combs founded Bad Boys and installed his lifelong friend, Mr. Pierre, into the role of the president. At the time, Mr. Combs had many connections in Michigan, including, among others, to the Black Mafia family, aka BMF, a drug trafficking and money laundering organization that is rumored to have seeded Bad Boy. Oh my gosh, this is getting deep, y'all. This is some, DEA type stuff. Accordingly, upon information and belief that Mr. Combs' associates, including Mr. Pierre and the third assailant, spent significant time in and around Detroit, Michigan. One evening between the spring and fall of 2003, Miss Doe was out with friends. It was not uncommon for her and her friends to frequent bars and lounges in the Detroit area. A certain of Miss Doe's friends were well connected to people in the music industry. On the evening in question, Miss Doe was with her friends in the lounge when she was approached by who she later learned was Mr. Pierre. Mr. Pierre was with his own friends, including the third assailant. Mr. Pierre and the third assailant and their friends were dressed in suits. Mr. Pierre repeatedly complimented Miss Doe's appearance, saying that she was hot amongst other things. He then began talking about his self-described best friend and brother, Mr. Combs. Specifically, Mr. Pierre continually stated that Mr. Combs would love to meet Miss Doe. Mr. Pierre eventually called Mr. Combs and put Miss Doe on the line. Mr. Combs told Miss Doe that he would love to meet her and that she should accompany Mr. Pierre to New York City on a private jet. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Pierre directed Miss Doe to go with him into the bathroom at the lounge. Once inside, Mr. Pierre began to smoke crack cocaine from what it appeared to be an aluminum can. After he finished smoking crack, Mr. Pierre suddenly took out his penis and demanded that Miss Doe suck his peen and forced Miss Doe's head down to perform oral sex on him. After sexually assaulting Miss Doe, Mr. Pierre directed her to accompany him and the third assailant, a third member of their group, to an airport in Pontiac, Michigan, where Signature, a fixed base operator, had prepared a private jet to take all 4 of them to New York City. Upon information and belief, the private jet landed in Teterboro Airport. Upon departing the jet, 2 black SUVs were awaiting the group. Miss Doe got into the SUV with Mr. Pierre and the third assailant, and the other member of the group went into the second SUV. The SUV brought the group to Daddy's House recording studio owned and operated by Mr. Combs and Bad Boy. While at the studio, Mr. Combs and his associates, including Mr. Pierre, plied Miss Doe with drugs and alcohol. As the night wore on, the 17-year-old Miss Doe became more and more inebriated, and eventually to the point that she could not possibly have consented to having sex with anyone, much less someone twice her age. While at the studio, Miss Doe was gang raped by Mr. Combs and a third assailant, Mr. Pierre, in that order. While Mr. Combs was raping Miss Doe, he complained that he could not get off unless she pinched his nipples as hard as she could. What the hell? Okay. This is my first time reading this, obviously. Mr. Combs then watched as the third assailant, who Miss Doe had not even realized had begun to have sex with her, raped Miss Doe, and she told him to stop. After the third assailant was finished, Mr. Pierre took his turn at raping Miss Doe and then violently forcing her to give him more oral sex, during which Miss Doe was choking and struggling to breathe. When Mr. Pierre was finished, he left Miss Doe in the bathroom alone. Miss Doe fell into a fetal position laying on the floor. Her vagina was in pain. Finally, after a period of time, Miss Doe regained her bearings. However, she could barely stand up following the gang rape and had to be helped to walk out of the building and back into a car. She was taken back to the airport and flown back to Michigan. Oh my gosh. However, she has very limited recollection of the transportation home. Only remembers being in a car sometime early in the morning. Unlike many of the victims who have come forward after decades, Miss Doe can prove that she not only met Mr. Combs on the night in question, but he was in his studio in New York City with him on that night. Remember, when viewing these, Miss Doe is 17 years old. And this is how we dressed in the early 2000s. You know, the short mini skirts with the belt. She got on a Dolce & Gabbana top. Like, you can tell this was taken back then, even the quality of the film. This is definitely how we dressed in the early 2000s. So she was definitely at Diddy's house, at the studio, excuse me. Then they go on to say, Miss Doe had lived with the memories of that fateful night for 20 years, during which she suffered extreme emotional duress that impacted nearly every aspect. Miss Doe's face has been blurred in the following pictures for the purpose of anonymity. In her life and personal relationships, given that brave women who come forward against Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre in recent weeks, Miss Doe is doing the same. To that end, Miss Doe brings this attention-seeking, injunctive, declaratory, and monetary relief against the defendants in violations of the Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Act, NYC Amendment Code 10-1101. They also go on to say that Miss Jane Doe is a citizen of Canada. The defendant, Sean Combs, is a citizen of California. Defendant Harley Pierre is a citizen of New York. The defendant, the third assailant, upon information, is a citizen of the state of New York. So then in line 48 on page 10, they go on to say Miss Doe knew that speaking out against the defendant would be extremely difficult and that she would be likely subjected to retaliation and defamatory slurs and attacks. However, in November 2023, Miss Doe read about a lawsuit filed against Mr. Combs by Cassandra Ventura, aka Cassie. Miss Ventura's suit described a decade of physical and mental abuse. Most triggering for Miss Doe was reading about Miss Ventura's allegations of sex trafficking and being forced to have sex with other men against her will. Miss Doe obviously understands that she too had been sex trafficked and that Mr. Combs' behavior in forcing women into non-consensual sex was not an isolated incident or uniquely only to Miss Ventura. Then days later, Miss Doe read about the case filed against Mr. Pierre and the suit that alleged that Mr. Pierre used his position of power at Bad Boy to groom and sexually assault his former assistant. Seeing two other women bravely speak out against Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre, respectively, gave Miss Doe the confidence to tell her story as well. As such, she filed this suit. Once again, as you guys see at the bottom, the lawyer is Douglas H. Woodger, who was the same man who took down Harvey Weinstein, who was the same man that got Cassie Ventura that huge settlement in less than 24 hours. So she definitely has a good team behind her. This whole situation is crazy. Now, Diddy is speaking out. So